Hey there! Have you ever felt obligated to play a video game? Like, even if you don't actually play it, you at least have to log in to keep that daily streak going. Or maybe there was a new minor update released. It's not big enough to be a DLC, but it's just big enough to pique your interest. Well, if you haven't experienced these, then consider yourself lucky. But in this day and age, one of the things I despise the most is when a game, or game developer I should say, doesn't respect the time of its player base, and instead is constantly trying to guilt trip you into playing their game so they can monetize your fear of missing out. Or FOMO for those of you who like acronyms. The more professional term used to describe this business model is games as a service, or live service games, with the latter sounding like those gambling games you'd catch your uncle playing at the local pub. To me, it's an annoying practice, because nowadays, where we have so many games to play, and so little time to actually enjoy them, having a developer constantly trying to guilt me back to their game after each new update becomes surprisingly stressful. Now, this isn't quite the same practice as DLC, which I'll get to in a moment, but how did this annoying practice actually start? Well, my first experience with this was all the way back in the early 2000s, with a little known Korean MMO titled Ragnarok Online. This is a game that I have incredibly mixed feelings for, and have spent far more years of my life playing than I'd care to admit. But the reasoning for that was a clever combination of the game design, the fear of missing out, and the fact that you had to pay a monthly subscription fee to play it. Ragnarok, like any MMO, is a game that requires an incredible amount of grinding to play, and the longer you play, the more punishing the grind is. You see, back when it first released, the highest level you could get to was level 99, and this took forever. I don't mean days, weeks, or months. No, it took people literal years to achieve this back then. The biggest issues came from the sheer amount of EXP needed, combined with how pathetically little you got from fighting enemies. There were no EXP quests. All you had was the grind. Fight enemies forever. That's it. Your EXP was measured in a percentage, showing how close you were to the next level. If you ever died, you lost 1%. At first, that's barely anything. But at higher levels, that could be an entire day's worth of work gone. That's right, a single death would wipe out all of the work you did, let alone if you died twice. Just to put that into further perspective, the amount of experience points you needed to go from level 98 to level 99 was essentially the same amount of experience you needed to go from level 1 to 98. It was brutal. Combine this with the fact that in order to play, you had to pay a monthly subscription fee. So what does all of this mean? Well, for me, it meant that I felt guilty if I wasn't playing. I had to play because I had to get my money's worth. And hey there, sorry for interrupting, but yes, I know, it looks like shit. Trust me, I am painfully aware of how bad this looks. Unfortunately, my camera's autofocus decided to mess up, and I didn't notice until it was way too late to do anything about it. So there will be a couple more shots that look like this. I guess just leave a comment for how many blurry messes you see, and I will pin the first one I see. In the future, I will try to be more careful, but I had to point it out before somebody else did. So yeah, sorry for inserting myself like this, but I'm gonna let you get back to the video now. Okay, goodbye. If I ever died while playing, not only did I feel like I wasted that time, but ultimately I felt like I wasted my money too, because I wasn't making any sort of progress. It took me quite a long time to shake off Ragnarok Online, and while I did dabble with other MMOs such as Final Fantasy XI, I did ultimately discover that I can't play MMOs without feeling guilty for not playing them. So for me personally, I actually swore off MMOs for good. But while I may have been done with MMOs, MMOs were not done with the world. Because you see, a couple of years after Ragnarok Online, another game took the planet by storm. World of Warcraft. Now, I've personally never played it, due in part to all the reasons previously mentioned, but there's no denying what an absolutely ridiculous cultural phenomenon World of Warcraft became. It seemed that for a while, everyone was playing it. even celebrities, which again, in those days was pretty huge. With that though, came the true realization of how utterly profitable the subscription formula could be. Believe it or not, during the peak WoW years, it was not that unheard of for people to be losing their jobs or failing to do other life responsibilities, all due to the addictive nature of the game. Now this video isn't meant to be a deep dive into MMO culture. I just wanted to use these two games to sort of paint a picture as to how this whole games as a service stuff began, and really my first interactions with it. While I may have broken away from that specific corner of it, unfortunately, there are aspects that still haunt me to this day, which brings me to Monster Hunter. Man, I have such a love-hate relationship with this series now, and honestly, hate is probably too strong of a word for it, but I digress. My first Monster Hunter game was Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, with Metal Gear Peace Walker actually being the game that introduced me to the series. More on that here. I came in at a time where, when playing the game, all the content was there. You paid for Monster Hunter 3U and you received a complete and full game. Now, Monster Hunter has always been a grindy game, and I'm not against grinding. In fact, I like grinding in games. I mean, you're listening to the dude who once spent weeks on Destiny Islands and Kingdom Hearts on the PS2 just to get to level 100 before leaving the island. I've started files on Final Fantasy VII and grinded the first screens of the game just to get Meteor Rain as my limit break before even getting Barret as a party member. So yeah, just to be clear, I don't mind grinding. Now, back to Monster Hunter. As I'd mentioned, when I started 3U, all the content was there, and there was honestly a lot of content to be had. I have over 2,000 hours in Monster Hunter 3U, so when 4U was announced and released on the 3DS, I was chomping at the bit to start the grind all over again. But with 4U, things changed, and not entirely for the better. You see, Capcom has this thing they do with Monster Hunter now. They did it with 4U, Generations, World, Rise. In fact, they'll probably do it forever. And it's what I like to refer to as drip-fed content, or DFC for short. Back during 4U, people were praising Capcom for all the free DLC they were providing, when really it wasn't DLC as it's intended to be. But instead, it was locking content behind a wall until Daddy Capcom said that we could play with it. Capcom had a bit of a history with this, with Street Fighter Cross Tekken being in the spotlight for a while when it was discovered that future DLC characters were on the discs consumers bought, but they had to pay money to access them once Capcom decided to fully release them. This was referred to as on-disc DLC. Now with Monster Hunter, it is a bit different, because the DLC they offer is typically free, so it seems pretty petty to complain about it, until you realize that 1, it actually hinders your progress, and 2, it's just a really cheap ploy to get you to come back and keep talking about Monster Hunter forever. Marketing wise, it's brilliant, and I can't knock them for their ingenuity, but as I said, I dislike it when a company actively wastes my time. So how does it hinder progress? Well, let's look back at Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. In these games, your goal is to, well, hunt monsters. Each quest you choose has an objective to slay or capture a specific monster in roughly a 1-hour time frame. After slaying a monster, you can carve pieces from it, and at the end of the quest, you are also given quest rewards. The pieces received from carves and from quest rewards can be used to make new weapons and armor. You repeat this process ad nauseum. It's a lot more fun than it probably sounds being simplified down like that. A lot of weapons are built off of previous weapons. So for instance, in my case, the weapon I primarily use is a switch axe. You typically want to have multiple types of whatever weapon you use to hunt more effectively, i.e. a weapon for each element. So for me, I figured I'd make a fire switch axe using the Rathalos line. I played the game as normally and kept fighting monsters to upgrade it further and further until suddenly I ran out of monsters to upgrade it with, but I noticed it wasn't fully upgraded either. Sure enough, I was missing the Silver Rathalos pieces. But the Silver Rathalos quest wasn't in the game yet. It wasn't paid DLC or anything. It was a part of that DFC I mentioned earlier. It was on the cartridge. We just weren't allowed to have it until Capcom said that we could. So what happened? Well, it meant that once they finally unlocked this content, it was completely useless to me. By that point, I had already had a better fire switch axe and just stronger weapons in general, meaning that the time I put into trying to make the Rathalos weapons was utterly wasted and amounted to nothing. You see, Capcom does this to try to keep their players coming back every couple of months. If you keep your players coming back, you keep them talking about the game, which can of course increase sales, etc. From a business standpoint, I get it, but ultimately it doesn't really work on me, and instead leaves me feeling bitter that I wasn't able to play and enjoy the game I spent my money on in the way that I wanted to play it. I realize that this might sound a bit entitled, but ultimately I don't think it's asking all that much to have access to the content that you already paid for when you start the game. If it had been traditional DLC and not content that was just locked on the 3DS cartridge, then yeah, it would have been a different story, but unfortunately it wasn't. In regards to DLC, I actually don't consider it to be an annoying process as long as it's done correctly, which sadly isn't always the case. In an ideal world, DLC should be something that's conceived and thought about after the release of a game. A developer would create what they consider to be a finished product, and then later on, sometime after release, maybe they get an idea for a new story or a new area you could explore. Maybe it's not big enough for a sequel, so it gets relegated to DLC. Early on, this is sometimes called an expansion pack, albeit that term was typically reserved for MMOs and Roller Coaster Tycoon. There have been plenty of examples of companies doing this correctly. For the most part, Bethesda was pretty good at expanding upon their games without the DLC feeling like it was necessary to get the full story or experience, with Fallout New Vegas having some of my all-time favorite DLC campaigns. Indie developers are also pretty great at this, with The Messenger receiving a fun tropical-themed DLC campaign, and Shovel Knight, well, let's just say when it comes to free extra content, Shovel Knight is still the reigning champion, with 3 additional playable characters, each with their own stories, gameplay, and even levels to some extent. All for free, assuming you own the base game. And then you have the DLC that radically alters the entire game so much that it makes the base game moot. And I realize it's going to sound like I'm picking on Capcom here, and that's because I am. Going back to Monster Hunter, you have Monster Hunter World, a game that while being absolutely record-breaking across the board with its sales success, still used practices that felt like they didn't really respect the time of the player base. When World first released, it was fun, but it felt a little hollow at points. Perhaps it was rushed out the gate, but after finishing the base game, I didn't find myself having the same draw to keep playing it like I would have normally done. Then started that famous DFC. Every couple of months, they'd release a single new monster in an attempt to try to get players back into their game. But for me, this wasn't enough. I came back to World when they released Devil Joe, did a few hunts, then immediately dropped it again. As more and more content was released, instead of feeling excited, I just felt annoyed. What fun is it to return to something only to complete it immediately? Instead of just dripping out content, why not work on it, wait a bit, and release it all at once, but as a larger expansion? Oh, they did that too? And it made the game worse? Okay. Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. Now, I could go into the deep dive about the rocky start Rise had upon release, such as not even having the true ending of the game, but I'm going to cut Capcom some slack here, due in part to the fact that it was released in a very hectic time where, you know, the entire world was shut down, so I get it. That's not the issue. What is the issue is that when Sunbreak was released, just how much it changed the overall gameplay of Monster Hunter Rise. You see, the main gimmick of Rise were these special rampage quests, which pitted you against a lot of different monsters all at once. These hunts weren't quite the same, and it played a lot more like a tower defense game. Reception-wise, it was hit or miss. Some people seemed to really enjoy it for shaking things up. Others found it a bit tedious. I personally fall somewhere in the middle. Monster Hunter games are known for having a ton of mechanics and systems, with each game building upon the last. And from the outside looking in, it can definitely seem a bit daunting. So as to not sound like I'm rambling, I'll do my best to explain what this all amounts to in the end. Essentially, grinding out these quests in post-game could lead to unique equipment that could only be obtained through these quests. You have to do a lot of them, but by doing so, you can get unique versions of each weapon type. You can activate a system to ramp up weapons to add new skills to them. Like most Monster Hunter mechanics, it's pretty in-depth. And then, just a year after release, we got a large paid expansion to Rise, titled Sunbreak. And wouldn't you know it, they literally tossed all of this out the window. They didn't build upon it at all. They simply pretended it didn't exist and moved on to something different. Sunbreak introduced a couple of new maps, some new monsters with the returning ones from previous franchises, and of course, a slew of new mechanics. Capcom has a history of releasing an updated final version of these Monster Hunter games. As I mentioned, I started with 3 Ultimate. Well, before 3 Ultimate was Monster Hunter Tri on the Wii. In the West, we received 4 Ultimate, but before that was just Monster Hunter 4 in Japan. It's not a new concept. The quests in these games are typically split into 3 ranks, which are essentially difficulties, being low rank, high rank, and lastly G rank or master rank depending on the game. As you progress through the ranks, the weapons and armor you require from higher ranks is just pound for pound better than the lower ranking equivalents. Meaning once you're using G or master rank gear, the high rank gear is pretty pointless. What am I getting at here? Well, Sunbreak, being the big expansion to Rise, introduced Master Rank, where base Rise only had low and high rank. While one could argue that the existence of Master Rank gear makes all the previous low and high rank gear pointless, that's actually not the point I'm trying to make. Because when it comes to weapons, you still needed to build them off of low rank and then high rank monsters first. Typically anyway, there are some exceptions. So once Master Rank becomes available, you can further upgrade those weapons, which makes sense. Except Rise had an entire weapon system built off the Rampage mechanic, which Sunbreak dropped entirely. Therefore, if you, like me, spent a ton of time on these Rampages just to make these specific Rampage weapons, only for Sunbreak to come out and make you realize that you can't even upgrade them past the base game, therefore making them useless almost immediately. This could be made even worse for new players, especially since Rise and Sunbreak are basically packaged and sold together now. New players will be playing the base game and making these Rampage weapons, especially because the game is basically pushing you to do so, only for them to eventually start the DLC, find out that that mechanic has been dropped completely and that all of their time was wasted. Stuff like this just gets me questioning why? What was the point of making a game that introduced these very specific mechanics that were baked so heavily into the story and lore, only for the DLC to do away with them entirely? Because if Capcom had this plan from the very beginning, that means that they knew that doing those quests would ultimately be pointless. But instead, it almost looks like this DLC might have been a response to the reception of those mechanics in the base game. That's purely speculation on my part, and honestly, with the fact that the DLC was released just a little over a year after the base game, it makes me think that they had this plan from the beginning, which means that they had no issue having players waste their time on pointless mechanics. There is a big difference in games having grinding in them and games just actively wasting your time. Hell, if a game is built to be a time waster, I'm okay with that as long as it's honest. I know a lot of people play gacha games, and while I don't play them personally, at the very least, they're not trying to hide what they are. For the most part. I still play Pokemon Go almost every single day when I walk my dogs because I'm outside and I like playing dumb collecting games. A game like Pokemon Go definitely has a lot of those FOMO mechanics baked into it, such as rewarding the player for logging in each day to catch at least one Pokemon and spend one stop. But with a game like Pokemon Go, you expect that. It's a free game after all. Similar to, say, Multiverses, which has daily missions you can do to build up coins to purchase new characters and whatnot. Again, it's a free game, so for whatever reason, I don't feel guilted into having to log in every single day to do these daily tasks. But the moment I purchase a game for $60, only for it to be secretly full of login rewards that make me feel guilty for not getting them, or for them to drip out the content that is locked away on the disc or cartridge in an attempt to get me to continue playing the game forever, it's just frustrating. I mean, the sad thing is, if a game is good, I'm going to play it forever. In my previous video, I talked about the immense amount of hours I put into Hades once I started playing it, because the game is that good, it's that fun, and wasn't using cheap marketing tactics to try to get me to play more of it. It's fulfilling in its own right, exactly as it is. The reason I would grind for literal hours on the first screens in Final Fantasy VII is because it was fun to me and I liked being overpowered early on in the game. Almost every single game I play, if I'm enjoying it, I'm going to play it again and again and again and again. If I'm having fun, I will already play it daily because I want to play it daily. But if you drip feed your content or add in daily login bonuses, it literally has the opposite effect on me because it feels like the developer isn't respecting my time, is instead trying to manipulate me back into playing their game. The last thing I want is to be playing a game, looking at the clock and realizing I have to stop playing this game, turn on another game and get that daily login bonus just in case. Or even worse, playing a game and then suddenly feeling bad that I missed the daily login bonus for a different game. I know it seems dumb, and ultimately it is dumb, but those feelings are what a lot of these developers are banking on. They want you to feel that way so you come back and play their game. I realize the simple solution here is to just not care about any of this, but the thing is, this tactic was built this way for a reason. It quite literally plays on the psychology of their consumers and is especially effective on people who might have an addictive personality. So, now that I'm down from my soapbox, what are some games that you used to enjoy, or maybe you still do enjoy, that have features like this that you don't enjoy? Let me know! And in the meantime, make sure you're getting your daily SimplyAJ bonus by watching one of my videos each and every day.